and welcome back to the very last episode of HalidonMusic's podcast series on the Baroque Era. My name is Sarah Joy, and today I will be talking about the lives of two very important composers from the Baroque Era, which was roughly between 1600 and 1750. And even if you haven't heard their music, you may have heard their names. So today I'll be talking about Handel and Bach. They were actually born in the same year, and but followed very different trajectories in life in terms of career. So I think it's interesting to compare and contrast the two composers. So we'll do a little bit of that today. Before we get started, I want to let you know that Halidon Music did create a lovely Spotify playlist with the complete recordings of all of the pieces included throughout this series. Instead of the cuts and clips that we play in the podcast itself, you can listen to the full recordings by visiting that playlist. All right, so let's start out by talking about Handel. He was born in 1685, born in Germany. He was a composer and violinist who traveled widely, but ended up in England and remained there for the rest of his life. In 1703, he became a violinist with an opera orchestra in Hamburg. And 2 years later, his first two operas were produced there. After that, he traveled throughout Italy, and during this time, he was writing more operas, as well as two oratorios. And then in 1710, he became the Kapellmeister at the court of the Elector of Hanover. Then, the next year, he visited London, where his opera Rinaldo was produced and very favorably received. That was 1711. And then he returned to England permanently this time in 1712. So that's a quick overview of his early life and early career positions. Let's talk about his relationship to the genre of opera. So I saw two different sources. One said 1719, another said 1720, but around that time, he became the director of the Royal Academy of Music, where he would compose operas as well as conduct them. And he had great success during this time. He became very, very popular, actually so popular that he kind of made some people upset because he was a foreigner, German-born, living in England and having all of the success, and they were not happy with that. After some time, the English public gradually became less interested in Italian grand opera, and so the Royal Academy went bankrupt. Handel didn't get discouraged. He obviously loved writing in this genre, and so he started some other opera companies, but unfortunately each of those failed with some not great financial ramifications. So this is when he began to turn his attention to the genre of oratorios. This is around 1741. These were specifically written for theater, not the church. Handel, I believe, preferred the freedom of the theater, which I can understand during that time. And the reason why he chose religious topics, biblical stories, was because everybody in that society knew about them. They were very, very familiar with biblical stories, and so those topics and those characters would reach out to a wider audience. Near the end of his life, unfortunately, he went completely blind, was not helped by surgeries that he had, of course, during that time. That was just kind of par for the course. And then he died in 1759. But let me talk briefly about his character, just as a person, his personality. He was known to be very kind and humorous, although this did change whenever he was feeling ill. I want to say rheumatism. So whenever he wasn't feeling well, of course, he would lash out at people, and he was he had a temper. And some people considered him to be rough around the edges. One of the other things that they didn't particularly like about him, as I was mentioning before, how he was not necessarily accepted by all. They considered him to be a little bit, maybe not rude, but just, less than polished manners, I suppose. But again, he was very kind and funny. He had a great sense of humor. So it sounds like a fun guy to be around. And then as a composer, here are just some highlights. Whenever he was being trained at an early age, he wasn't just taught the local practices or the specific techniques of German writing. He was exposed to many different countries and their styles as well. In essence, I mean, he was a very cosmopolitan musician, basically, and that was, of course, enhanced by his further travels as when he was a little bit older. He drew much inspiration from popular music, and he seemed to, how do I say this? He basically just seemed to gain inspiration from and to also consider the tastes of the common man. I thought that this was really interesting. He loved art, and you can hear that in his compositions, where everything that he wrote really was designed to create beautiful visual scenery in your imagination as you listen. You know, one source that I was reading, they basically just described his style of composition as picturesque, which I think is a perfect description. And I just really love that that's a unique characteristic of his style. All right, now let's talk about J.S. Bach, one of the greatest composers in the history of Western music. So Bach was born in 1685. He was a German composer and multi-instrumentalist. And in contrast to Handel, while Handel traveled widely, Bach stayed in central Germany. And although he and Handel were contemporaries, born the same year, they never actually met. I believe they tried, but it never happened. Bach was born into a family of musicians, so uncles, cousins, his dad, his brothers, they were all successful professional musicians. And when his dad and his mom died, I believe he was 10, that's when he began to live with his older brother, Johann, who was also a church organist. So this is around the time when Bach continued his musical studies with his brother's help. And then in 1703 in Arnstadt, he became a church organist. This is where he wrote his first church cantatas. Now, unfortunately, in this position, as I mentioned in an earlier episode, he started having run-ins with the leadership. And I think, one of the reasons was he was very unhappy with the talent available to him at this place. So the musicians that he was working with, he didn't really feel like they were up to the task of for performing at the level that he was hoping for. In 1707, he became a church organist in Mühlhausen, and this was under better working conditions, so this was a better situation. And then in 1708, he was appointed court organist and chamber musician for Duke Wilhelm Ernst, Duke of Weimar. And this is where he really started building up his reputation. He became known as one of the most talented organ virtuosos of his day. In 1717, he was hired by Prince Leopold to serve as the court's director of music, and this is in Cöthen. This was probably his favorite position that he held. He was paid very well, he was given a lot of freedom, and during this time, Bach wrote the cello suites. So I know that I've already played an example earlier in the series, but this is going to be a different one from a different suite. So this is cello suite number 3 in C major. This is movement 6, the Gigue. Also, while he was working here, he composed these are so famous. The Brandenburg Concertos, which I've also played an excerpt of this earlier, but this is Brandenburg Concerto number 4 in G major. This is movement 1, Allegro. After leaving Cöthen, he was appointed cantor of St. Thomas's School in Leipzig, and this was in 1723, and this is where he remained until his death in 1750. The duties that he had in this city, he was teaching, he was an organist, and he composed and directed church services for, I want to say, 4 different churches in the city. I might have that number wrong, but I believe that that's a close approximation. As in earlier positions, he had run-ins with the leadership, and from one source that I was reading, a lot of this had to do with the fact that if he perceived that they were encroaching in any way on his freedom, he would perhaps overreact. He was very easygoing about arrangements in the beginning. Perhaps he made some concessions, and then as time went along, those little concessions started to bother him, and then it really blew up into something that he was very unhappy with. His major choral works were completed in Leipzig, so including the Passion according to St. Matthew, so St. Matthew's Passion. He was very, very prolific throughout this time, and he actually wrote the majority of his cantatas, which this number is mind-blowing. Over 200 cantatas, and listen to this is just insane. Scholars have found that Bach produced around 150 cantatas in 3 years while living here in Leipzig. 150 cantatas in 3 years. I cannot imagine being that prolific. Amazing. In his later years, he started focusing on fugal and canonic compositions, and unfortunately during this time he started going blind, and then an eye surgery led to his death in 1750. Unfortunately, and as I stated before, his music fell out of fashion by the end of his life, and so Bach was mostly forgotten after his death, but his music had a resurgence, a revival. So Bach's biography was published in 1802, and then I think the resurgence was mostly due to Mendelssohn, who performed the St. Matthew Passion in 1828. And after that, of course, we now know him today as one of the greatest composers in the history of Western music. So Bach's character and his personality, he just seemed like a wonderful person, very humble. Whenever someone would ask him, about his talent level and his skill, this is a quote that he responded with at one point. He said, "I was obliged to be industrious. Whoever is equally industrious will succeed equally well." He would always give friendly commentary on other composers' works. I think that the only exception to that would be if a student was asking for constructive criticism, some helpful feedback, but on the whole, he was very positive. Perhaps not with musicians that he would work with. Arnstadt is a great example of that. I don't know that he was terribly kind to people who he saw as being, he was pretty brutally honest if they weren't performing very well. He lived a simple and quiet existence so that he could really focus on his craft and his art. So as a composer, he was, of course, known as the master of counterpoint and taking themes of music and developing them and playing with them. And again, as I talked about in episode 2, the interplay between all of those voices, just creating these rich conversations and textures within music. Highly prolific, again, as I was saying. He wrote chamber music, orchestral music, organ music, harpsichord music, motets, so many more works. And then this is, particularly what I find meaningful. His cantatas were him, in essence, presenting a sermon through music. So I just want to end with a few quotes from him. just because this really shows his core motivation, and I believe it was his spirituality, his relationship with God. So this first quote I've said before, but let me share it again. Quote, "The aim and final end of all music should be none other than the glory of God and the refreshment of the soul." And then this one, I believe it was written in his Bible. I can't remember which verse it was written next to, but "Where there is devotional music, God is always at hand with his gracious presence." So that gives you a good idea of why he dedicated himself so greatly in the way that he did. All right, so let's close by listening to this recording of Bach's Brandenburg Concerto number 3 this time in G major. This is Movement 3, Allegro. That concludes this podcast series on the Baroque era. I hope that you enjoyed this as much as I did. Thank you so much for listening.